Ladies and gentlemen, my name is TotalBiscuit. I'm here to ask and answer one simple question. WTF is Battle Chasers Nightwar? A very good question. I'd never heard of this damn franchise. I don't think a lot of people had, but Jesse Cox had. It was a 90s comic book series, and noteworthy for taking character tropes at the time and sort of flipping a lot of them on their head. Good example being that the big, tough-looking robot is actually the healer, whereas the small, petite female character is the tank and all that kind of thing. So, right off the bat, there's the potential for interesting characters, interesting character interaction, and after watching the trailer, I was certainly sort of blown away by the art style. So, I spent a decent amount of time in it. I'd say the timer up here is slightly off since I've had it alt-tabbed a bit, probably about 7 hours or so into this, and I've certainly reached the point where I've got my opinions in a row, and I am losing my patience, unfortunately. And I'll explain why that is, and explain why that might not actually be a problem for you, depending on the kind of things that you enjoy as we go through. It's brought to you by Airship Syndicate, and it is essentially a JRPG, for all intents and purposes, with the exception of the fact it wasn't made in Japan. It uses a active time battle-like system in which your characters attack in the order of which they have the haste stats, or maybe they've been bumped up the list by a certain ability, all that kind of thing. You know, usually everybody will get a turn before it goes around again, but there are ways and means of messing with that, and ways and means of speeding up your attacks, and the attacks have various speed characteristics as well. Some take longer to cast than others. We're going to dive into the options menu, see what's available here. Not really a lot on the video side of things, which is a little surprising. But you do have the monitor display change option, which is a nice little option that's starting to creep into more and more PC games as of late. Always good to see support for multiple monitors. Under graphics options, you find even less, as you can see here. The game is not massively demanding, but it certainly has some nice effects every once in a while. It would be nicer to have more than just that. Audio sliders are exactly how you'd expect them to be. You've got some language options. So in terms of audio, you have quite a lot, honestly. I'm very surprised that they have that many audio languages, because there's quite a lot of VO in this game. And text languages cover even more than that. So, pretty damn impressive localization on this title. And in terms of the game, you have tutorials and subtitles available as well, and that's really about it. Okay, so let's dive in. I have just beaten the second major story dungeon, as well as a couple of little side dungeons here and there. And I feel like I know what I'm talking about at this point anyway, because it's unlikely that I'm going to be playing any more of it. But I'll tell you this for a fact, I might grab some of these loading screens as wallpapers, because they are gorgeous. Strangely enough, the graphic style of the overworld is a little different to what you see in those particular scenes. I don't know if perhaps this is reflected in the comic book as well, because I haven't honestly read it, but I did find it a little jarring in terms of the difference between the way that the exploration areas look and the way the character models are versus the way the overworld looks, which is a entirely different art style, really. It's strange. It looks a little out of place. And I guess we're getting straight into a battle, because I don't have a damn choice in the matter. The overworld is absolutely full of these things. And unfortunately, it brings us quite immediately onto one of the first problems the game has. But before I explain that, I want to show you the combat system and how this works. So, you've got a couple of different things you can do. You've got your basic actions. Actions cost no mana whatsoever, so you can do them whenever you like. They are often also good ways for building mana in the form of overcharge. Overcharge is temporary mana, which only lasts for the length of the fight that you're in. This means that regardless of whether or not your mana pool is completely empty, and you can only refill your mana either at fountains, by resting at the inn, or by taking potions and using regenerative abilities, it does always mean you've got the capability to do something, so you're not forced into auto attacks all the time. You can see under abilities there are indeed quite a lot of them, and they're usually broken down to offensive and defensive abilities. I've spec'd out Gilly here to be more of a tank, because that's frankly what she's good at. She doesn't have to be. You have a perk system which allows her to go more of a brawler route, but in this case I've gone for the tanking stuff. So one of my basic abilities would be taunt, so force everybody to attack me. So you notice a few things happened there. She gained defense and she gained overcharge, and you can see down the bottom there a little bit extra mana. So In some cases, you consume bonus overcharge to do bonus damage, depending on the ability. In most cases, though, it's just a little bit of bonus mana that you can get to use on something else. Alright, so if we move on to him, we'll do just your basic Swift Strike here. That'll go off pretty much immediately. That's an instant attack. And then there are some attacks that do take a little bit longer, or abilities that do as well. For instance, we could throw down Nature's Boon here, which is very fast but not instant. So we might get attacked before that goes off. In this case, we didn't. And it's going to set a heal on damage kind of ability, which is a nice little combo, especially against enemies that do multiple light attacks. You can actually stack it up so that your tank doesn't even take any damage, or even ends up regenerating more than is done to her, which is pretty damn good. So since I have some overcharge, and you can gain that from being hit as well, I might as well throw an ability at him. So I can do that. And as for these guys, they are not a challenge, really. They're going to die very, very quickly. We'll do a straight-up gut punch on him. That's half his health gone immediately. Sunder, and they're probably all going to die from this ability right here. And they did. And herein comes the first problem, and it's a facet of the biggest problem this game has. And also something that you're going to have to be tolerant of if you want to play it. It's a pretty standard JRPG trapping. It's one of the things that JRPGs are often criticized for. The problem is that, well, some people say it's just part of the genre, but I really do not believe that anymore. I've seen advances in the JRPG genre that have gone past this, and that's the idea of pointless trash fights. This game is full of them. Unavoidable in the vast majority of circumstances. The dungeon areas have a bunch of trash fights in them, and the overworld has unavoidable trash fights that are blocking pretty much every junction on the overworld map. There is a teleporter that lets you get across the map, but you have to get there, and usually after you've done a dungeon, trash is going to respawn on the map, and you're going to have to go through it again. And none of this is any challenge at all. I outlevel these guys by 3, I outgear them completely. Really, if I just hammered the spacebar here, and I will win this fight without any problems at all, really. And I have so much passive healing and stuff, the chances are I'm going to come out with more health than I started with. And this is even against something like a War Brute, which is a little bit tougher than your standard enemies. Not really going to take a lot of damage here at all. Frankly, a non-issue. And since I know I'm going back to town anyway, me taking damage doesn't really matter. Managing this damage and being careful with your attacks and mana, now inside a dungeon, that's much more important. Particularly since those dungeons have a tendency to be quite long. The one that I just did took 90 minutes. And I did that on hard, which is the second highest difficulty. When you go to a dungeon, you first have the option of doing it on normal or hard. Now, I picked hard because I wanted a bit of a challenge, and I was finding the trash to be a complete walkover. Hard is really not that hard either. I did the dungeon with ease. I mean, I'd lost no characters. I haven't had a character death up to this point, I don't think. It just made it take longer. And these trash fights that you find here in the world, well, they are never going to pose a threat to you, at least not at this level anyway. It's possible that later on in the game they become somewhat more challenging. I very much have my doubts on that one. Especially since I've talked to other people that have played it and they've reported that, well, no, they really don't actually get any harder than this. And it drags the game down to a crawl. The game becomes a massive slog. Sadly, one of the really good parts of the game actually contributes to the slog, and that is the quality of the animations on display here. You probably noticed character models, colourful, vibrant, nicely defined. The attacks, serious impact, well animated. A good selection of different animations available. Some reuse here and there, but for the most part, very well stylized. And when it comes to things like audio assets, oh, it sounds like you have punched a dude in the face. Serious amount of impact. Yeah, you feel free to run off if you so desire. There we go. Huge amounts of impact. But there isn't an option to speed it up. There's no option to skip the animation. There's no option to speed up the animation. And there is no auto-combat option either. Now, there are some games that have realized that this is a problem. Persona is a great example of that. Persona has a lot of trash fights in it as well. I quite like Persona, but Persona has an auto battle option, knowing that, yes, you are going to run into fights that are not going to be a challenge to you whatsoever. So, why bother? Why bother forcing the player to press the buttons and watch all of the animations and blah-de-blah-de-blah? Good question, because I don't think there's a good answer for that. And I think if your answer to that is, well, that's how JRPGs have always been, no, they haven't, and no, they shouldn't be anymore. Even if that were true, maybe now is the time to get rid of a lot of these trash fights from JRPGs. There are other dungeon crawler games that have done fights better lately. I think a good example of that would be Darkest Dungeon. Every fight in that game matters. It certainly feels like it. They're all very tactical. The enemies are generally very challenging, which means that you have to be aware at all times. You can't just be reckless. You can't just willy-nilly hammer the button and hope for the best. No, no, no. You are going to be dealing with enemies that can do some serious damage if you're not doing the right things at the right time. And as a result, it means that those fights tend to remain fairly interesting. In the case of this game, though, they do not. They are kind of all over the place. Sometimes you will run into enemies that are of equal level to you, but consider this. We happen to run into these random trash that are the same level as me, but the dungeon that I did, despite setting it to hard mode, hard heroic mode, which I believe gets me a heroic chest, there's a legendary mode that you unlock after that if for some reason you want to do the long dungeon again. I really can't imagine why you'd want to do that, but I think at that point, if you're choosing that option, you are very clearly into this whole JRPG combat thing, and your patience is not a concern. In that dungeon on hard mode, I was fighting mostly level 6 and 7 enemies. This random trash pack is level 9, which is, I mean, really not a huge challenge, considering, but more of a challenge than the last one was, certainly. You can see they're barely hurting me. This is, to me, a deal breaker. And that really makes me sad, because pretty much everything else that I've seen in this game I've really enjoyed. There's some really nice systems going on underneath this combat. A bunch of interesting buffs and abilities that interact with each other. If I were to gut punch this enemy and then set this guy to do a rupture attack on him, that's going to do an enhanced bleed. If I make an enemy bleed and then use obliterate with the big robot, I do bonus damage. You can clearly see things like Nature's Boon interacting very interestingly with Tank and the abilities that they happen to have. There's all sorts of things you can do, and there are more characters to unlock as you go through the game, so you can put together some interesting and unique compositions. The abilities in particular I find quite intriguing. There's like Gaia's Fist, where you can do damage and apply Gaia's Grasp, so you can completely wail on a high HP target and regain health, and, you know, a great way to do that would be to do an attack which may be attacked more than once, since you might gain extra health from that. There's a lot of interesting things you can do with that system. The problem is the system is really irrelevant when you have fights that are so easy that I can look away from the screen and just hit the spacebar button to finish them. This is fixable to some extent. You can certainly, by all means, put an auto combat option into the game that speeds the fights up. It doesn't get rid of the fact that a lot of these fights are simple and a little bit of a waste of time, but it means that you're going to get through them faster. There are certainly some things that could be done in terms of the pacing of this title, and I actually heard from the developer that they plan on doing a pacing pass on this game quite shortly. Now, unfortunately, my videos can't just wait for people to fix things in games. That's just not how things work, I'm afraid. I'd love to be able to offer that, but I really cannot. Throw down damage shield there to absorb that bleed. So this may very well be fixed in the next few days, but I'm not convinced about that. I think they're going to need to work a little bit harder on it. Now, outside of the combat, which is going to be taking the lion's share of your time, what else is there to really do? Well, the Overworld Exploration sometimes yields these exploration areas, which involve finding loot, buff shrines, lore books, crafting materials, sometimes crafting benches, which actually allow you to do said crafting, since most of the crafting benches actually have to be found in dungeons, which is a little bit odd. A little bit of a weird choice. They very much limit what you can do when it comes to crafting. You can make potions in the main town, but you can't make anything else, at least not yet anyway. I wonder if they're going to do that later. So I would spend hours looking for a damn crafting bench so I could actually make some stuff, and found that I had so many crafting materials I could make new rings and necklaces for all of my party. I guess that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. It was just odd that I spent so much time waiting for a choice, or at least an opportunity to get myself some crafted items. And the system itself is quite cool. Not only can you craft a large variety of items, but you actually have a chance to craft if you're short on materials. There's a failure chance in that, but it is there, which I found to be really quite an interesting choice. What I don't find to be an interesting choice is the damn map. It doesn't actually tell you where you are on it. Now, relatively, you can figure out that I'm in the white area up there with the glowing gate, but having a little marker saying you are here would hardly be too much to ask, right? One wouldn't think so. Outside of that, there's a decent amount of dialogue, a few side quests to do here and there, and there are vendors to level up and all that sort of thing. And that is potentially interesting, because you're going to get access to, hopefully, some much more interesting items. And the loot system is really rather good. I'll have a quick look at this before we run into another fight, and show you exactly what I'm looking for here. You got your basic stats, which are exactly what you'd expect them to, but you also have these additional little functions. Like, for instance, right now, Garrison has equipped the Chieftain's Might, and that has Commanding Strike on it. What does that actually do? Well, it says each attack will increase the attack power of an ally by 106 for one turn. Pretty magnificent, frankly. I believe the Braces of Shielding, that gives Nature's Touch, has a 10% chance when attacked to cast a heal with each hit, etc., etc. And you can get all sorts of little things like that. And I love that. I'm a sucker for procs, what can I say? And these look like some relatively interesting procs. Now, as you probably noticed, thankfully, if an enemy is much, much lower level than you, like, I don't even know what level this guy is, let's check it out, you are actually allowed to avoid them. Unfortunately, you will run into stuff that is, for the most part, unavoidable. In this case, these are 6 levels below me. You'll notice that I fought guys that were, like, 3 levels below me, and it didn't let me avoid them. So, maybe they could extend that a little bit more. I don't know. I mean, obviously, in this case, it's a complete waste of time, but maybe that's another solution to this potential problem here. As well as, of course, speeding up the animations and all that sort of thing, and being able to skip through this screen a little bit quicker than you could, all that. It's a little bit of quality of life here and there. This is the main town, and this is where you're going to be able to do things like crafting, upgrading, all that sort of thing. I could spend 750 to upgrade the curio shop if I so desire. What are they selling at the moment? Well, some nice crafting items by the looks of it. That seems like a good idea. I currently have quite a lot of gold, so maybe I'm going to go upgrade the smithy instead and see what kind of weapons you can get. There's also a strange little wizard at the top there who will trade tokens for really rare and powerful items. And item acquisition and loot acquisition in a game like this is frankly the sort of thing that I want. It's the sort of thing that I find most interesting. There we go, let's upgrade the blacksmith. Higher level recipes, chance to stock uncommon equipment, that sort of thing. All good stuff. Is there anything good there? Well, no, he occasionally has sales on cheaper stuff as well, which is kind of nice. But you'll see we could get some beginner's guides to refinement, all that sort of thing. The crafting system is really quite deep. And if I had the patience to continue to play the game, then I would probably be quite into that. Honestly, it's just a shame that something which is so damn key to the game is also slowing everything down to a damn crawl and turning it into a giant slog. It's primarily combat-oriented, but there are things that have got to be done, as far as I'm concerned, about that. 90 minutes in the second major story dungeon is a little bit too much. You know, we're not talking about a dungeon the quality of Persona 5 or anything. These are not that interesting, I'm afraid. You know, the story beats in there are minimal at best. You're fighting mostly the same sort of enemies. They're hardly expansive and interesting in terms of their visuals, although they're certainly not bad. They're just more generic settings than I would have hoped for. There's the required levels there. It's like, I could get the booty blade if I wish, but that would be for next time. But it does drag the game down to a crawl, and that's where what I mentioned earlier comes into play. What is your level of tolerance for that sort of stuff?
Welcome back.
Good question. In my case, I would not say that it is particularly high, if I was to be completely frank with you. I think you are probably quite aware of that by this point. I don't like pointless fights. I don't like games wasting my time. Now, you can argue, well, that's part of the gameplay, but, well, in that case, I feel that's a very weak part of the gameplay. The gameplay should provide a challenge at all times, as far as I'm concerned, and in this case, it certainly has not. Most of the time, even in hard mode dungeons, I am not being challenged by the combat. And I want to be, because there are so many cool systems involved. I want to be. Maybe if they let you access the top level difficulty from the very start, instead of forcing you to play it through once and then go through the whole damn dungeon again. That may help, although that won't fix the problems with the overworld. Or the exploration areas, to be frank. Or the side dungeons. Only the main story dungeons, it seems, are affected by that. I had a quest to go into the sewers and clear out some spiders, which was its own little dungeon. That had no difficulty option attached to it whatsoever. It's just a little bit of a shame, really. There's quite a lot of things that you can do in this game. Unfortunately, most of them involve fighting. So what else are you really going to do? It's not like you can avoid it. It sounds like I'm ragging on the same thing, but it really is the only major problem I've had with this. But it's such a core problem that it's a massive deal breaker for me. For you, maybe not so much. Maybe you are able to tolerate that kind of thing. Maybe that isn't actually a big deal for you. In which case, great. That sounds phenomenal to me. Maybe you will enjoy it. There are some nice things to find. There's some really cool stuff. It even has a little fishing minigame, because can't have a JRPG without a good fishing minigame. Not exactly sure why that sent me right out of that cave. But hey, there we go. I believe I've explored that cave anyway. Things like movement speed increases to characters would help. You know, you can't sprint in the game for some reason. Yeah. You get my point. Like, I can't really rattle on this point anymore. But I can't ignore it either. It's too big a deal for me to ignore. I wanted to like it, and I found that I was being dragged down so much by it that I ended up bored, which is not what I was looking for out of a game like this. I am not the world's biggest JRPG fan, but I've certainly played a decent number of them and enjoyed quite a few, particularly Persona. But in this case, while it is extremely well presented, clearly has a wonderful selection of in-depth systems under the hood, and a potentially very interesting story, it is bogged down by very samey, slow, and unbalanced combat. So perhaps keep an eye on what this patch over the next few days does. There is the possibility that that may very well resolve some of the issues I have with it, in which case, lovely, wonderful. I would be very happy to hear that that were the case, because it's certainly a game that deserves more in that regard. Battle Chasers, Shadow War, Nightwar, what? Why Night? I don't even know why. Has it got anything to do with anything? I couldn't tell you. It's Battle Chasers, let's be honest. It's currently available on Steam for $30 or your regional equivalent. My name has been TotalBiscuit. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, by all means do feel free to click the like button. If not, the dislike button is right over there. And I'll see you next time.